So, Mr. Pahlavi, thank you very much for your time and for being with us. So, what kind of support are you actually asking from the EU, and what would be the impact that would you like for your country?
Well, as you know, obviously there has been a campaign of bringing maximum pressure on the regime, which has been the sanctions on the regime and perhaps additional sanctions on the IRGC and so on and so forth. I've been arguing for a long time that parallel to maximum pressure, there has to be also a policy of maximum support for the Iranian people, particularly ever since we had this revolution starting 5 months ago after the death of Mahsa Amini that has triggered a completely different level. If you go in the direction of empowerment, it's always the better way to go in terms of helping a nation address the issue of what the people ask today, which is a change of regime. In what way can the world be of assistance and support? There has to be a component that actually addresses the issue. In that sense, there are areas of immediate need and immediate impact that we've been talking about with legislatures, and I've indicated that this could be in 2 specific areas. The first one, the most vital element, is internet connection. It is important for Iranians to be able to remain connected to the outside world, be able to communicate their messages, including media, and receive information, but also for purposes of domestic communication, for coordination of activities or organizing whatever it is, they need to be able to have that access available. So any kind of technological support, as well as facilitating equipment that needs to be transferred inside the country, access to various VPNs, Starlink as an example, a combination of all those will remedy the issue, but it could certainly be further assisted. Another component, which is an element of domestic pressure on the regime in the context of a civil disobedience nonviolent form campaign, is to bring more pressure on the regime by means of labor strikes. Now, such labor strikes have to obviously be organized, but needs to also be funded, because most of our workers cannot afford to go on a long-term strike. They need to feed their families. So we are working at ways of seeing whether or not we can have a strike fund created and to be able to fund it. One of the areas that could be the quickest way to fund such a strike fund would be to repurpose the confiscated or frozen assets of the regime, which is after all the Iranian people's money, and repurpose that towards funding those funds. These are the kind of actions that I think in terms of policy could be something very helpful in this campaign.
And there is an active campaign actually asking from the EU and the West in general to proscribe the Revolutionary Guards, but it didn't happen so far. Why is it so important for you, and why do you think that it didn't happen?
Well, it's been legislated. It's a question of being adopted by governments to actually make it go through. Why is it important? Number one, the most element that has sustained this regime in power by an instrument of repression at home, and in terms of the regime's influence and impact on the region, by virtue of the presence of Hezbollah or Hamas, which is backed by the IRGC, whether it's in Syria or Lebanon or elsewhere, and even on European soil and continent, intimidation of media or other things, or planning to terrorize members of a Jewish community in England or elsewhere. This is all part of the same fabric of what the IRGC has always been an instrument of. And by further adding pressure on the regime by sanctioning the IRGC and stating it as a terrorist organization could bring even more abilities to freeze their assets, which is certainly a big chunk. And also it will at the same time create an element that will make it even more likely for defections to occur. Because in our scenario of transition, we're trying to include maximum elements into the after regime situation. A scenario of exit strategy has to be provided. Understand that it's a very top echelon of this paramilitary mafia that benefits from the arrangements they have in the regime in terms of the monetary aspect of it. But the bulk of the IRGC members are not benefiting from it financially. They are getting salaries, sometimes not enough to cope with. They even have to have a secondary job. How long can they sustain themselves in that package? If they think that the time has come for them to reconsider how long they want to stick with this regime as opposed to join with the people, the more pressure there is on that organization, the more labeling of that organization. Most of them would not want to be part of that designation. And in fact, it will encourage more defection. So it has a dual purpose. It has the purpose of whatever threat the IRGC as a whole represents at home and abroad, but it could also expedite a process of defection, which would be helpful to the transition.
But given the broader geopolitical context, wouldn't that kill the prospect or the chance to revive the nuclear deal, for example?
Well, look, I think we are at the stage where reviving that deal by itself is not going to remedy all the problems. It may not even perhaps address in time the whole nuclear threat that the regime poses. The ultimate solution to the problem, and we've always argued that it's the nature of the regime itself that brings all elements of instability, not just on the nuclear issue. You're talking about terrorism, you're talking about supporting radical groups, you're talking about more export of a radical ideology. All of this tied to this regime. Every element of instability, regionally or beyond, is again the root cause of it being the regime. Not to mention that current contributing to the Russian front against Ukraine by means of what the regime is doing right now. If you look at it, at the end of the day, the solution is for this regime to disappear. And I think that none of these agreements is going to necessarily eliminate the rest of the problem. So I'm not looking at it only from the vantage point of a nuclear deal revived, because the first time around, it didn't get give much benefit to the West, but it was mostly beneficial to the regime itself. In this context, when there's still time, before we get to scenarios that are certainly not preferred, but could be down the line unavoidable, such as preemptive strikes or any kind of military action that I would not like to see happen, it's become even more important at this time to support the movement from within. So the whole regime disappears, as opposed to be stuck with it and have to find all sorts of maneuvering in terms of making last-minute deals.
But Mr. Pahlavi, why you didn't manage so far and during the years of your political activity to form a comprehensive political alliance against the Islamic Republic? And do you think that the current alliance actually will be inclusive, is inclusive, and will ever be inclusive?
Well, first of all, for a coalition to form, there has to be an impetus that makes them immediately impactful. And part of it is that until now, there was a majority of forces outside of the secular democratic forces representing the alternative who were still sort of considering maybe we should attempt yet again some reform within. And in the overall psyche of the Western world looking into it, it was still that factor that came to many people's mind. With what happened 5 months ago and the Women Life Freedom movement, with the fact that even those groups who until yesterday were thinking we should still attempt reform, they have given up on it. So you have now a convergence of former reformists that can converge with us so that it expands this coalition at the right time and at the right moment. Not that we didn't try it before, but everybody sees now and recognizes the fact that this vacuum has to be filled, and it has to be based on a good coalition to be built. Number two, despite our efforts among us Iranians, the biggest problem we faced for 43 years is that most governments in the outside world restricted the dialogue to the regime and its representatives only. There has never been a dialogue directly with those who represent the voice of the alternative. Finally, the world has decided to now start engaging with us. And this is pretty new. This is pretty recent. And perhaps at the aftermath of today's revolutionary state in Iran that started about 5 months ago. In that context, now that we are able to talk to parliamentarians, they are beginning to listen to us, they want to enter dialogue with us, that obviously reinforces and expedites our direction of broadening our coalition and entering that kind of dialogue. So these two factors, domestic and external, are today putting us in a better position to be able to actually address the issue of working together, offering a plan, and move forwards towards the transition.
So assuming that the Islamic Republic falls, what would be the role that you would run for? Do you see yourself as the new Shah of Iran, as your father used to be?
It's not a matter of what position I end up with, nor am I running for any office. However, my role is very important in terms of the political capital that I enjoy, to bring as much solidarity on a common mission that drives us to manage the period of transition towards the formation of a constituent assembly, which is the only vehicle through which people's representatives will have to make all the decisions necessary in adopting a new constitution, debate the content of the future system, to be finally ratified by means of a referendum. The process, therefore, is a democratic one, whereby during the transition, you obviously have to have an interim government that has to manage the country's affairs temporarily, which can be populated mostly by people who are already inside and can fill the void right there, but also to work the formula for preparing the stage for that election of that assembly. The goal is to get to the point where we can have that constitutional assembly formed, elected, and begin working on whatever is the future package presented to the nation. That's our mission right now at this stage.
How long would all this process take? Meaning, of course, that the economic situation in Iran is really bad. So how long would it take for an economic reconstruction? And how long would it take to form new democratic institutions for the country?
Well, obviously, the components are such that you have a host of groups that have been anticipating once the change occurs in terms of formation of political parties, or at least beginning to bring the elements, because ultimately it's going to be the political parties holding elections to form the first government. So naturally they have to prepare for that. At this stage, what we're talking about is the instrument that can manage the transition phase. It doesn't have to be very long. I think realistically we're talking maybe 1.5 to 2 years maximum, but within which time there's enough time to set the stage for the election of the Constituent Assembly and not to drag our feet too long, because all the reversal of sanctions, everything that depends on a normalization cannot last too long. We need to be able to also fund the interim period, so the interim government have at least means to conduct whatever it needs to do. The country cannot stop functioning. Hospitals, electricity, water, whatever it is. So that's another challenge. And we have a whole bunch of different groups, expert groups, that are studying many aspects of that transition. For instance, in terms of transitional justice, in terms of a truth and reconciliation type process that we saw in South Africa, elements of this nature. How do we deal with the remnant of the regime? Those who have to stand trial for the crimes they have committed. What part of it deals with the national reconciliation package? This is really a work of experts, those who have to work on the economy, those who have to work on the environment. So we also have, besides just a political coalition, expert groups that have to work various aspects of this transition and offer formulas and suggestions. So all of that comes into the collective package. What I can see happen is that the minute the regime falls, immediately these instances that so long have always been disregarded or ignored by the regime, that doesn't mean they didn't exist, they never were given a chance to actually do something constructive, could immediately come at play. There are many people outside of Iran, within the diaspora, that have the know-how, the skills, the means, whether it is for future investment, whether bringing more expertise to the subject, or many faces that can join their counterparts within to again contribute to the formation of these structures that we need for the transition. All of these are elements that can be addressed fairly quickly, but again, at this stage, what's really important in terms of expediting the process of change is a lot of it part of what the world is prepared to do to help bringing maximum support for the Iranian people. That's something that has to be discussed, and that's precisely part of the discussion I'm having these days with legislators in different countries, and as well as the European Parliament, which I will address tomorrow.
You know, it is said that one day in the past, the Western countries, actually fearing that Iran could become a superpower, pulled your father from the throne. Do you share this view?
Some people argue that. Whatever it is, we know one thing from our domestic perspective, that Iran could have been a South Korea. Instead, it became a North Korea. In other words, we went backwards rather than forward. Is that conducive to more stability? No. Is Iran weakness something that has contributed to more safety or economic interest, or has actually been the reverse? Every arrow points to the direction that if that theory held true, the net result was no gain, but in fact a loss, if you say that that was the Western prism. So I have a hard time buying that idea, but even if you were to suggest that that was the intent, the result is certainly not what we were expecting.
And
so regardless of that theory...
Actually, what makes you believe that this would never happen again?
Because I think that our immediate neighbors recognize that whatever democratic transition in Iran that will contribute immediately to a direction of stability. And stability is a precursor to engagement, cordial relations, investment, development, regional cooperation on all the grounds depends solely on how stable and how transparent and how caring for their own nation is in the equation. And as such, it is our necessity and national interest to be able to work with our neighbors, to be in cordial relations with the Arab world, with the Israelis, our immediate neighborhood, and of course beyond. And as you know, in terms of values, what the Iranian people cherish in terms of values, whether it's about human rights or everything else, it's the same values that you have today in the Western world. This regime is the antithesis to all of these values. So weakening the country and giving it at the hand of those who are in direct and diametric opposition to every value that we want to have, that you share with us, is a foregone conclusion. It's a matter of time for us to implement it, and the immediate ramification of it for a world that says we don't want any more instability. Well, in fact, we're going to address that. If Iran is the country that can say under proper governance, we can be a major partner with the West, particularly Europe, that has energy dependence. And Iran is the country that can be at least a solid partner, so you're not limited to what Russia is offering you, particularly under the current circumstances, or for that matter, immigration, that is becoming more and more of an issue for Western countries, because how many more refugees can you absorb in an already saturated Europe? In that rationale, the quicker we address the Iranian issue, you can put an end to that trend and, in fact, perhaps even reverse it. All of this goes to the direction that a stronger Iran in a democratic format is not only a reliable partner, but in fact it diffuses every element that would have been otherwise threatening that the current regime is clearly demonstrating vis-à-vis its immediate neighbor and the rest of the world. The answer is there.
Does that also mean that the West should worry for the growing military cooperation between Iran and Russia right now?
Well, obviously, because when you have a regime that out of weakness is prepared to become somehow at the disposal or used by other players in the region, the net result is that this could become a threat to another perspective. Iran's cooperation right now with Russia is a clear indication that the regime is in fact trying to count on Russia's support for their own survival, and is in that game assisting what Russia is doing right now in the Ukraine, for instance. But on the other hand, Iranians are enraged by the fact that out of weakness, the regime has already given away so many things that has not been in Iran's national interest, whether it's the Caspian or what is happening right now in the Persian Gulf with the Chinese and so many of those other components. Again, rétablissement, if you could call it, will at least bring an end to those unfair arrangements or deals and will keep everyone honest in the project. And that again goes back to whether Iran and Iranians are represented by a government that truly and first of all cares for our national interests, but understand the necessity to work with others, because we cannot have a one-sided scenario. We have to be able to see eye to eye and work with each other on every problem that we face.
What would be your message to the Iranian people?
پیام اصلی در این لحظات اهمیت ادامه این مقاومت هست تا لحظه موفقیت. در این مورد همیهنان هم باید بدونن که امروز جهان توجه بیشتری پیدا کرده نسبت به کسانی که زبان مردم ایران و حرف مردم ایران رو به گوششون میرسونن، کسانی که جزئی از راه حل هستند و زبان آلترناتیو به این نظام رو معرف هستند. از این لحاظ تقویت این حرکت و درخواست حمایت حداکثری از مردم ایران چیزی است که در بحث‌های ما هست و در همین موارد هستش که با جهانیان اکنون داریم صحبت می‌کنیم. حالا که در دیالوگ با این نیروها که تا به حال محدود بوده باز شده و از این فرصت داریم استفاده بهینه رو می‌کنیم.
Where do you think that Iran will be standing in 5 years from now?
به محض اینکه نظام تغییر پیدا کنه، آنن شرایط از حالت اضمحلال دوباره برمیگرده به حالت صعودی و ترقی. اینو فکر کنم همه درک میکنن. بنابراین هرچه سریعتر ما بتونیم این تغییر رو در ایران ایجاد بکنیم، زودتر خواهیم تونست بپردازیم به مشکلاتی که نتیجه عدم مدیریت درست مسائل بوده که این همه لطمه به کشورمون در تمام زمینه‌هاش زده. فکر کنم همیهنان هم کاملا واقفن که یک دولت دلسوز و معرف خاص اونها خواهد توانست این مسئله رو برطرف بکنه و ما هر چه زودتر بتونیم برگردیم به مسیر پیشرفت و ترقی تا همطور در جا بزنیم و عقب بمونیم از بقیه دنیا. این یه چیزی که به نظر من همگی کاملا ازش آگاه هستیم و داریم رو مسئله پیش میریم.
Okay, Mr. Pahlavi, thank you very much.